peeps! Welcome to lecture number 3! Yay! Let's do it! Alright, so we got a two-parter this week. We technically had a two-parter last week, but I had it all in the same PowerPoint, and just in the middle I said, here's a good break point. This week's lecture is just in two parts. It's in two different PowerPoints. So you're going to listen and take notes to both of them. I don't know why this is in two PowerPoints and the other one wasn't. Peg, who knows why Peg does what Peg does? But this is the way this lecture is. So we're going to talk this week. It's Witches Week. Yay, witches! But before we do that, we have to talk about their world. I will say I'm kind of an expert on witch hunts. I'm writing a book right now for a very reputable press about witch hunts. And I know a lot, and most of that I'm not going to tell you, and you are welcome. But it's worth saying here that what we're talking about in America for our witchcraft cases is that they're very much connected to colonial New England, so sort of Massachusetts, Connecticut. The Massachusetts witch trials are the most famous, but there were witch trials in Connecticut, to a lesser extent maybe. There were some in Virginia. But they're also all connected with this religious sect called the Puritans. So we need to talk about them. The first half of the lecture, we're going to lay out some stuff about the Puritans as this sort of group of people who came here very early on in colonial North America and settled in parts of America now considered New England, mostly Massachusetts, like I said. Anyway, so some intro stuff, shall we? When we talk about Puritans, what you probably heard, the word you heard in grade school and high school history was the word pilgrim, which is a testament to how bad our history education is in public schools. I'm not bad-mouthing public schools. I'm a big fan. My kid went to public school. But our history educations can be pretty bad for a lot of reasons. This is not that lecture either. But pilgrim is a word that means a person who goes on a religious pilgrimage, like to a shrine, to a particular saint. It is not a word that any religious group has ever used to describe themselves. And the group that history erroneously calls the Pilgrims were the Puritans. Okay, so that's who they understood themselves to be. And here's the thing, all that stuff that you think you know about pilgrims, you know, the cute stuff in grade school where there was the funny hats, and maybe you made construction paper hats, and then half the class got the cool Indian headbands with construction paper feathers, and if you got stuck with the black hat, you were all sad because you wanted the construction paper feathers, because who doesn't? But much of that stuff seems sort of Thanksgiving charming, unless you know more about these people. These people, the Puritans, they are a sect of Protestantism. They are an extremist sect. They are religious fundamentalists, and they are, like all religious fundamentalists, difficult and unpleasant people because of their fundamentalism. So it is super worthwhile not being romantic about these people. Yeah. You can tell I'm no fan. Which is why I like spending time on them, because that's the interesting stuff, right? Yay for weirdos! Yay! Anyway, all right, next slide. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story, and you don't have to write all this down until we get to the part that you see on the PowerPoint. But come the early 1500s, a group of people, a guy named Luther is the most famous, got sick and tired of the Catholic Church. They're like, I don't like this and I don't like that. And so they formed these protest groups to protest some stuff that's going on in the Catholic Church, that the priests don't seem to be celibate, that they seem to be super rich, that the people aren't allowed to read the Bible for themselves. And this is about, we've got now the printing press and we've got printed Bibles, and the Catholic Church says the Bible is really none of your business. Priests will interpret it for you. So there's this group of people in mostly in Germany, and then it spreads to the rest of Europe, who are like, well, screw that. And eventually, because the Catholic Church does not care if you don't like it, eventually they split off and they formed their own religion, the Protestants or the Protestants. I think I talked about this briefly last week. Anyway, so the Protestants are born in the 1500s out of sort of rebellion with the Catholic Church and a notion that somehow all of the old ways are bad and that they're going to be better at being Christians than the Catholics. And I would argue a lot of Protestants still think that. It's why so many Protestants think that Catholics aren't Christians, which is so profoundly stupid I hardly have anything to say about it. But nonetheless, it is an idea out there. So here's the thing. And then, so the Protestants in general tended to be sort of more hard, not sort of, definitely more hard line than the Catholic Church. Because the one thing the Catholic Church has going for it is kind of a, we've got a lot of power, you do you, thing. This is not perfect, but Protestants in general in the 15 and 1600s are significantly more theologically rigid than the Catholics, in part because they're being way more literalist about the Bible. I think they still are. Some sects, not all of them. And then throw into that some people who are like, I don't care how rigid and how extreme the Protestants are, we need it to be more religious and more extreme. And the Puritans are one such sect. Indeed, they're so rigid, they're so extreme, they're so dogmatic about their approach to the Bible that they irritate everyone they run into. So there's a bunch of Puritans in England, and some of them get their heads cut off, and some of them get thrown out of England. They go to Amsterdam. They go to Holland, to Amsterdam. Amsterdam, literally the place where this notion of religious freedom is born. America did not invent religious freedom. That was the Dutch. And the Dutch looked at the Puritans and went, yeah, no, thanks, no, and kicked them out. And so we've got this sect of religious extremists, Protestants, but super hard line, and they want to, they need some place to go, some place to be them. And so literally they look across the water. We're getting some very early, because now we're talking the mid 1600s, early, sort of 1620s, 1630s. So Columbus came to the New World in 1492. Virginia was settled in the 1500s. So they know they can go there. They think, well, let's go there. We think historically that they were aiming for Virginia, but their ship was blown off course. I think men were driving and they were afraid to ask for directions. I just made that part up. And but anyway, they ended up in Massachusetts by accident. Keeping in mind it wasn't Massachusetts at the time. It was a place that would have had a different name depending on the native tribes that lived there. And a number of different tribes used those areas. The 5 tribes of the Seneca and the Wampanoags, and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so they probably landed in Massachusetts on an accident. They get off their boats and they find this abandoned village there. And it turns out because some colonizers had been there before and stayed long enough to give the people smallpox, and everybody had died. So they found this poor abandoned village. It still had the food and the housing and some dead people in it. And they're like, yay! God loves us. This is proof of how much God loves us, that he killed all these people and left their houses and food for us. Which tells you something about them that I think is fairly unsavory. Yeah? Okay. I think I got a map next. Let's go look at that. Next slide. Okay, probably nothing to write down here in terms of your notes, but I just wanted you to see. I know modern Americans are extremely bad at geography, so I just wanted you to get a sense. What we're talking about here with the Puritans is people who were English, essentially, migrating from England to the New World. And I think it's easy to think that they all came to Massachusetts, but they did not, as you see from this map. Indeed, a significant number of English colonists went to the Caribbean islands, and still there's lots of islands down there that are still fundamentally English at their root. And then, of course, we've got Virginia, Maryland, and New England over there on the North American side of the map. And then the little inset here, I think this is interesting if you peer at it. But what you have is, like, the people from Newbury, England, when they went to Massachusetts, they named a town Newbury, and they all settled there. And when the people from Ipswich moved to the New World, they named their town Ipswich, and so on and so on. So a lot of the New England town names are town names in England, and they're that because people didn't, it wasn't just like Frank and Betty and their two kids decided to go to America. Huge parts of an entire village would decide to go because the English economy was collapsing. And so the people would migrate together in big groups. And so they would get here and they would already have, you'd have a midwife or a healer, you'd have a blacksmith, you'd have farmers, you'd have all of that stuff contained already in your group ready to go. Anyway, little map. I like a map. Next slide. All right, so what they wanted to do here is they wanted to establish this thing that they called a city on a hill. And I always think of this like I have a picture here of the castle in the old Snow White movie, the original Disney animated film. And you have this sense of this, a city on the hill, this shining place. Like a place on the hill, you could see that castle in the sun. It'd be a dark and cloudy day, and then the clouds would part, and sun would shoot through the clouds in a beam and light up this shining white castle. And it'd be this beautiful, glorious thing, and you would look up to it, because it is up there on the hill. And you would look up to it, and you would admire it, and you'd be like, man, I want to be the people that live up there. They're after something kind of like that. With their city on the hill, and it makes sense. It's kind of the you don't like me, I'll show you impulse. That is, their Puritans are in England, and England's like, yeah, no thanks with your religious craziness, and they go to Holland, and Holland is like, yeah, no thanks with your religious craziness. And so they think, we'll go to this place and we'll establish this community, and it'll be so perfect that everybody will admire us, and we'll show them they'll be sorry because we are so lovely. But again, you can see the danger in that. Look at Snow White there in the other picture. Oh, no, scary trees. That is that chasing perfection, particularly in community of human beings, is immensely dangerous. Because if you want a place to be perfect, you have to figure out whose definition of perfect is, and how far are you going to go to enforce the rules so that everybody behaves perfectly, right? So it's both admirable and super dangerous, this establishment of a utopia, a perfect place. All right, next slide. So what's their deal? What is it about Puritans that makes Puritans? Well, again, this is fundamentally a group founded around around religious ideas, theology, fancy word for religious ideas. So what are the Puritans' religious ideas? The things that make them Puritans, and first and foremost among them is this notion of predestination. Predestination is a thing I think we fundamentally don't really believe in that anymore. I don't know if anybody does. There might be still some Protestant churches, particularly some of the more fundamentalist one, who believe in predestination, but I don't even know then. Because predestination is like the opposite of free will. Predestination says you don't have a choice in where you go. The notion is that when you are born, you are predestined for either heaven or hell, for either God's team. Look at the fantastic nuns playing basketball and being so happy. That is pretty cute. Or you're born and you're going to go to hell because you are on Satan's team. Oh no. Though Satan has fantastic abs, apparently. So, it's not all bad. I joke, but fundamentally, if one believed in this thing, and some of you may, and that's cool, one would not really want to be on Satan's team, because we can make jokes about that. But no, this notion that hell is the place where all the worst things happen, nobody wants to go there. It'd be like living in 2020 for the rest of your life, only way worse, right? So nobody really wants that. But again, the key to predestination is this notion that you don't get a choice. It's not about if I am a good person and I am nice to my grandma and I help my mom unload the groceries and I get A's in school and I am faithful in my marriage and my kids don't turn out to be felons, I probably going to heaven. It's not that. It's just when you're born, it's pre-decided. You're going to one place or the other, and there ain't nothing you can do about it. That's some tough theology, isn't it? I don't think I'd like that. There's not a lot of choice. I like it, choice. American woman, big fan of choice. Anyway, predestination is not that. Next slide. Okay, so the bummer part. Feels to me in predestination it's all the bummer part, unless you got lucky and ended up on God's team. And even then, it wasn't because of anything you did. So the bummer part is all of these things. Individuals had no choice in their team. God and Satan decided who was on teams. They didn't call it teams. That's me being a 20th century person. 21st century, I guess. Anyway, your eternal destiny, that is heaven or hell, was decided before you were born. Okay, that's a bummer too. I think we all like to think we should have some choice in the world. And there wasn't much you could do. Going to hell sucks to be you. The problem with this, as you might imagine, is it takes away sort of the carrot and stick impetus of religion. And I don't mean to sound super cynical here, but one of the reasons that religion exists is to get people to behave in whatever socially the society wants, socially acceptable ways, whatever those are at the time. So the notion that if you're good, if you do the right thing, if you do what society wants, you'll go to the nice place. And if you're bad, and you don't do what society wants, you'll go to the bad place. But if you believe in predestination, the flaw with predestination is there's no way to tell. I mean, if you're either going to heaven or hell no matter what, then it doesn't matter how you behave. If you're predestined to go to heaven, you could be an asshole your whole life and you're still going to heaven because it was predestined. And if you're predestined to go to hell, it doesn't matter if you're good or you're bad. You could be super good your whole life and you're going to go to hell anyway, so you might as well be a jerk. So you can see the flaw in predestination is that there's no way to compel people to good behavior with predestination. And you can bet that Puritan religious thinkers saw the flaw and came up with a solution. Let's go see what it was. Okay, so if we think about Puritan theology as having really like a fork with two prongs, then one of the prongs is predestination and the other one is this covenant of works. A covenant is kind of a fancy word that sort of means contract, not really, but we don't have to worry about it too much here. But the notion was for Puritans that you could kind of tell which team a person was on by their works. Now, I was raised Catholic. I am not a Catholic any longer, but nonetheless, I was raised Catholic. And Catholics think of works as the stuff you do, your deeds. So if you do good works, you're good at work, you're kind to your children, and then you volunteer. Maybe you serve the pizza supper under the church on Sunday after Mass. Maybe you volunteer at the local shelter. Maybe you knit socks for poor children. I don't know. Good works. Okay? But for the Puritans, there was a notion that works was both your deeds, the stuff you did, and your stuff. So the notion was that if you did good deeds, that was good works. So if you did good stuff, you did nice things to people, you helped Abuela across the street, good works. You pushed Abuela down and kicked her a little bit. Oh, wow, that is some bad works. Really? You pushed down Abuela? Yeah, it seems wrong. Bad works. But also that your works were your stuff. So you have good stuff. You have a nice house in Claremont with a beautiful wooden fence and a Beamer parked in the driveway. Ooh, that is some good stuff. That's some good works. You live in a shabby rental with broken windows down on 9th Street in gang territory with a chain link fence and a 1988 Corolla in the driveway. Oh, that's some bad stuff. That's some bad works. So the notion here was, I used to live in Pomona, very fond of Pomona. It was that you could kind of tell, not for sure. Now again, we're not talking about if I did good stuff and I made money so that I could have nice things, that I could determine where I went, but rather that people who were on God's team were more likely to do good things and have good things because God was a good guy. And that people who were born to be on Satan's team were probably going to be assholes and have shitty stuff because Satan is, a creep. But it wasn't a for sure thing because we know from reading Job, see, I told you I used to be Catholic. We know from reading Job that sometimes God tests those he loves. And we also know from many horror movies that sometimes Satan can be a trickster who gives cool stuff to people so that they can go out and do shitty Satan-y things for him. Oh, Satan. So it wasn't for sure. It wasn't like, oh, you have a really nice car in a really nice house in a really nice neighborhood, and you volunteered the soup kitchen, you're for sure going to heaven. But rather, you're probably going to heaven, is what they think. And again, not because you did the stuff. The stuff doesn't make you go there. The notion is that you were destined for that place, and that's why you have the stuff. See what I mean? Yeah. So covenant of works is very much about that you could look at a person and maybe tell with some sort of like maybe 75% accuracy what team a person was on. And so there's your sort of, you can't just act like an asshole your whole life, because most people would not want people to think they were not on God's team, especially in a community that took this stuff really, really seriously. It would not be cool to be marked as someone who was failing the covenant of works. Does that make sense? Yeah. Well, you can't ask me questions. I wish you could. Next slide. Okay. So now we know a couple the two prongs of Puritan theology, predestination and covenant of works. Let's talk about how they dealt with dissent, because you can tell a lot about a society, but how they deal with dissent. That is, it's all well and nice when people are going along, when they're cooperating, when they're being normative. That is normal. Whatever society says normal is, right? Normal. Thing I'm not crazy about. But nonetheless, we know there's this notion of normative. Here's things people do. Here's non-normative, things people don't do. Anyway, you can tell a lot about a society when you look at how they deal with dissent. So I got two examples here. The first is Roger Williams. I got a great picture of him in the next slide. Roger Williams was a church elder. He came to Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1630. So he's comes to America very early. He's a church elder, and here the thing worth saying is, because the Puritans were a religious community, their church was not only really important to them, but it also functioned as the government. So if I say that Roger Williams is a church elder, what you can know is that he's also in charge of running the town, because it would have been the church elders who ran the town, would have run Plymouth. So he's 4 or 5 years into Plymouth, and he gets in trouble because Roger looks around and he says, you know, you people, you Puritans, and he's one of them. He's a church elder. He's a big shot. He's got nice stuff. He probably looks like he's on God's team. And he says, you know what I think? I don't know if religion should have this much power. That over in England, the church isn't in charge of the government, and maybe mixing up the two. Maybe that's bad, because it's people with too much power run amok. And the other church elders were like, dude, WTF, shut the heck up. And so they put him on trial for sedition, which is a fancy word that means like treason. And then heresy, and heresy is a religious crime. It's a sort of a crime against God. And they found him guilty of these two things, essentially sedition, treason against the people, heresy, treason against God. And they said to Roger Williams, out you go, bye. That is, they banned him. And this is a thing they used to do. They didn't have big jails they could put him in, so they just said, you have to go, you have to get out. Happily, Roger Williams, lots of people, the Puritans liked to ban people and toss people out. And in the 1630s, when there were hostile Native Americans along the borders of these places, and for good reason they were hostile. These people showed up and took their land and acted like assholes. Plus there was all the disease and death, remember? For a lot of people who were banned, it turned out very badly. It did not turn out badly for Roger Williams. He took some people that were like, yeah, what you say makes sense. Churches shouldn't have as much power. There should be a separation of church and state. And he went on to found Rhode Island, a state. It's the first state in America where religious liberty was guaranteed. That is, and how do you guarantee religious liberty? You separate church and state. which is a thing. Like, I think there's a lot of, I don't think, I know for a fact, a lot of religious fundamentalists in America right now who think, well, we should be teaching the Bible in public schools and we should be pledging allegiance to God at all public events. And the problem is that's a crossing over of church and state, because state by state we mean government. And the only way that you can have freedom of religion and freedom of government is to keep those two things separate. Because once you let one religion, say the fundamentalist Protestants, be in charge of the government and teach their version of the Bible in school, that means everybody else who believes in anything else, even other interpretations of the Bible, and we know there are many, those people get their freedoms suborned. This is our problem in America now, is that people, fundamentalist Protestants, are not only want the freedom to believe what they believe, they want to force all of us to believe it too. Therein lies the problem. Yeah? Okay. But Roger Williams is like, let's not do that. And indeed, when the founding fathers get around to founding a country 130 years later, after this, they don't look to Massachusetts and the Puritans and this religious fervor business. They look to Massachusetts and the separation of church and state. And for good reason. You can't have democracy without it. Anyway, let's go look at Roger Williams on the next slide. Okay. I just think that picture's funny. But I am mocking him, but that's what I do. That is my fallback, is mock everything. But what's interesting about this picture is that you see him here with this peace treaty with the Native Americans, and you see some colonial people in the background on one side of him and some Native people in the background on the other side of him. And one of the things Roger Williams was really good at when he got to Rhode Island is because he was about religious separation of church and state, and because he may have started his life as a religious fundamentalist and extremist, by the time he gets in trouble with Massachusetts, he isn't anymore. And he sees when he gets to Rhode Island that the best way that we create a cool place for everyone to live in is we try and collaborate with the people that already live here. And Rhode Island becomes kind of a model for how do you live alongside the Native Americans. Now, fundamentally, it ended up not working out very well, because the more white people that showed up in Rhode Island, the more Native Americans died. But unlike the Puritans up in Massachusetts, Roger Williams led community in Rhode Island did not make active war upon these people. So they killed them by accident. And the rock there on the side of the road is the plaque to Roger Williams, which you can't really see, but I just thought it was a pretty rock, and I took the picture. I didn't take the picture. I put it in the slide. Anyway, next slide. So our second example of what Puritans did with dissent is Anne Hutchinson, and the case here is a little less happy ending than Roger Williams. Anne Hutchinson was a midwife, a wife, and a mother. She was also a woman. Her father had not had any sons. He was a very devout Puritan, so a guy who took the religions that we've been talking about really seriously. And because he didn't have any sons, he gave his daughter a very good education. She got married to Mr. Hutchinson. They moved to essentially Boston. She was a midwife. We'll learn a lot more about midwifery in week 5. But essentially, midwives were like, they weren't just people who help with the birthing of babies. They were like first-tier healthcare providers. Your kids got sick, you didn't feel good, you called the midwife, because doctors didn't exist in the way we understand them now. Anyway, so she was, if we see over there in 3, the one that I've still got the font in white in, she was what we call a religious lay person. So she had this very strong education. She had Bible study in her house. She was very interested in theological ideas and talking about passages in the Bible. But she was not a clergy person because, she was a woman. Christianity, patriarchy, Anyway, Anne, in the course of her work as a midwife, begins to notice that, we're down here on 4 in the lower left-hand corner. She begins to notice that there's a flaw in the covenant of works. That is, covenant of works says, remember, that if your works, your deeds and your stuff are good, you're probably on God's team. And then if your deeds and stuff are bad, if you're poor, you're probably not on God's team. And she notices, because she sees people as a midwife, she sees people when they're having health crises, right? A kid is really sick, a baby is coming, um, times of stress. And in times of stress, she sees that oftentimes sort of well off or rich people don't behave that well. They seem kind of, I'll just say it, douchey. And it oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, poor people in crisis are quite godly, quite patient and kind and tolerant. And so she's thinking, I don't know if you can really tell who's on God's team and who's on Satan's team by their stuff. I don't think covenant of works works. So she begins to practice an alternate way to think about the Bible, the covenant of grace. And we will take a look at the covenant of grace in the next slide. So the dealio with the covenant of grace is that if the covenant of works is very much about your outside stuff, what people can see, grace is your inside stuff. We all have inside stuff. It's the secret you. It is, as it says here, number 2, that small, still voice that you sometimes hear inside you. And some of you connect that with a God or some kind of spiritual divine. And for some of you, it's your conscience or your whatever. You call it whatever you want to call it, because I am not the boss of you. But Anne Hutchinson thought that maybe the only way to know if you were on God's team or Satan's team was to listen with your heart, as it were, which is really your head, because your heart is pumping blood. But I mean, listen with your heart metaphorically, right? And that's how you tell which team you're on, and you feel for God's grace, thus the covenant of grace. So she thought that was a better way of knowing who was elect, who was on God's team and going to heaven, that didn't rely on who was well off and who wasn't well off. It felt to her more accurate and more fair. It meant that you didn't have to have really good stuff. You didn't have to have a Beamer and a house in Claremont to be on God's team. So as you can imagine, this covenant of grace was a very attractive set of ideas for poor people and for women, both groups that didn't have stuff. Poor people because they were poor, and women because women technically didn't own anything because of coverture, right? Their husbands and fathers owned everything. So you can imagine that this woman starts saying, no, church elders, who are also the government, I think you're wrong about your covenant. It's not the covenant of works, it's the covenant of grace. And then she's saying this stuff, and like poor people and the chicks are liking it. And you can imagine how much the church elders, who are in charge of things, who are bound and determined to create this city on a hill by their definition, how much they liked that from this mouthy broad. Yeah? Let's go see the next slide. This is obviously a painting done afterwards. We don't have any photographs of Anne, and probably the group of church elders she would have argued before. Not probably, we know for a fact it was 6 men, not 2, but 6 guys probably didn't fit in a painting. Anyway, it was very upsetting to the church elders, and patriarchy particularly unfond of women who don't know their place. So she was in big trouble. Let's go see how much trouble in the next slide. So you can almost see this coming, but in 1637, so not long after the Roger Williams imbroglio, Anne is put on trial for heresy. Remember, a crime against God, despite the fact that her ideas were popular, and she'd also never talked about grace in public, only in her house. Here's the other despite, and this is worth saying. There is a bunch of evidence for grace in the Bible. There's a bunch of it. There's indeed, I think, if you spend any time looking at the Bible, as much or more evidence for grace, this notion that you can hear God in your heart, than there is for the covenant of works, this notion that you can tell if people are good for how much stuff they have. Indeed, the Old Testament is really, because the Old Testament is the original Jewish Bible, and that's a document that is markedly anti-rich. So Anne had a really good theological point on top of everything else. So they put her on trial, and they were arguing with her about sort of the things that you are saying are not biblical. But it turns out there is a bunch of stuff in the Bible, like I said. And so they're saying, yeah, well, the Bible says this, this, and this. And she'd say, yeah, but it also says this and this. So they're doing that dueling Bible thing that religious people like to do, the people who take it really seriously. Maybe some of you. Cool. Good. Again, you do you. And the church elders were getting increasingly frustrated because they couldn't, beat her. Until finally it occurs to one of the men to say, hey, Mistress Hutchinson, how did you come up with this? And what Anne should have said was, well, I read the Bible. But she didn't, because she believed in God, because she believed in a voice where God spoke to you in your heart, not like he was in a burning bush or something, but in your heart. She said, well, God told me. What? God? God don't talk to women. Problem solved. They literally convict her of heresy simply for saying that God talked to her. She's a girl. God doesn't talk to girls. Heresy. Problem solved. Bitch, be gone. Let's go look at the next slide. So they find her guilty, and they banish her to Rhode Island. And here's the thing. You don't wait until spring to go when the weather's nice. You don't get 6 weeks to pack up your house and go. You're supposed to go right then. Indeed, they take this banishment so seriously. And indeed, only Anne was banished, but her whole husband and family went with her because, of course, yeah, right? One of her friends, a woman named Mary Dyer, got up and walked out of the church with her just in a show of support. And the very next year, they put Mary Dyer on trial for witchcraft, found her guilty, and hung her by the neck until dead. So, and I think there's a lot of historical connection that because she supported Anne, the church came after her. Anyway, the Hutchinsons were moved to a compound in Rhode Island, not Roger Williams' community, but one near it. The community was attacked. Everybody in the family was massacred in 1643, except for one daughter who was taken captive for 6 years, and eventually was returned to the community. So there are Hutchinson descendants in America now because of that one daughter. But anyway, so they banished her, and it was not only a death sentence for her; it was a death sentence for 8 of her 9 children. And her husband, and her. Which seems bad. Yeah. All right. Let's go see what's next. Oh, some stuff that's a lot more fun. Okay, I got 2 fun stories for you. One, the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard, to end this part of the lecture before we take a little break and then go on to witchcraft. So in the Puritan world, where the church was also the government, church rules, like the commandments, were also government rules. So there is a commandment that says, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife or oxen or other possessions. Gag me with a spoon. But nonetheless, the notion there is that you're not supposed to commit adultery. That once you're married, you're only supposed to have sex with your spouse, and to do otherwise is to break a commandment. And for the Puritans, it was to break the law. So this poor guy ends up on trial for adultery. And the witness is this neighbor who says, she testifies in court to this, you guys. I went to his house and I looked through the window and I watched him have sex with this woman that was not his wife. And they had sex 3 times. Oh my God! Wait, before we get to the man hung, hold on. So this woman stood outside this guy's house and she looked in the window long enough for these people to have sex 3 times. And that tells you something about Puritan society, too. 1, that's wackadoodle. 2, in the world we live in, the person looking in the window would be in trouble because we prioritize privacy and private property over your neighbor's desire to tell you who you can have sex with. That is, we may not like adulterers. I indeed think that an adulterer is just about the lowest kind of slime, right there with child abusers and people who abandon dogs and cats. Um, but it's not against the law. I don't. I think adultery is gross, but it's your business, not mine. Not yours. I'm assuming that you guys are not engaged in adultery. Most of you aren't married. But anyway, so so they found the poor man guilty of adultery and then hung him. They executed him for adultery. And then and there's another case. There's many of these cases, but my favorite adultery case. There's another man, same kind of thing. The neighbor says, I walked up the road to visit him, and he was in his barn, and I heard these noises. So I went and I looked in the barn, and I saw him having sex. But with who, you ask? Pig, tell us. With a pig. Pig with a pig. Man was balls deep in a pig. Wee! That's a bad pig impression. It's funner in class when there's people here. This is hard to do in my room all by myself. Anyway, this poor man. So apparently, according to the Puritans, that was adultery because he and the pig weren't married, and he was having sex with the pig, and maybe it was also pig abuse, but nobody cared about that. So the man was convicted of adultery, and he was hung by the neck until he was dead. Let's go look at the next slide. And the pig was hung too. That's right, people. They hung the pig for adultery. Apparently this happened more than once in Protestant fundamentalist communities. Apparently pigs were popular sex objects for guys apparently who couldn't get a girl. I don't know why a person would have sex with a pig. These are the questions I don't ask. And then you'd hang both parties, the man and the pig, which makes me feel bad for the pig. No word on whether or not the pig's pork chops were delicious. I don't know, but there you have it. Okay, all jokes aside, that's some crazy stuff right there, and it tells you something about the Puritans and their need for social control. So much social control. Their religious, extremist, fundamentalist viewpoint led them down a dark and dangerous path where they were willing to kill people, and apparently pigs, to maintain this very rigid notion of what they wanted their world to look like, which is, I would imagine, most of us, an approach to society that we would not care for. Yeah. Which is also going to get us at the witchcraft cases in the next half of this lecture. Okay, last slide for this section. All right, so endeth part 1 of this lecture. You can take a little break if you want, or you can go straight on to the next half. It's up to you. But it's going to be witches, which will be kind of fun, but depressing, but fun, because it's witches. I don't know why my voice got so high. Anyway, I'll see you over in part 2. Yeah, cool.